when the first Imperial ships darkened the skies over Earth. No one believed resistance would last more than an hour. The Empire had conquered hundreds of worlds before this one, and every world had fallen the same way. A sudden flash of power, a display of overwhelming technology, and then silence. But Earth was different, and the Empire would soon learn why. Because while their fleets hovered above the clouds like gods, watching ants, the people below were already preparing to fight, not with the weapons of a galactic superpower, but with something the Empire had never truly encountered before: sheer human defiance. In cities across the world, people stared up at the skies and saw shapes so massive they blocked the sun's strange angular vessels that hummed with energy, glowing symbols across their hulls, and fleets of smaller ships dancing around them like birds of prey. The first wave of attack was surgical, precise, and terrifying. Orbital beams cut through defense satellites, missiles were disabled mid-flight, communication networks were jammed, and global command centers were flattened in seconds. Still, the humans did not surrender. Instead, they scattered, reorganized, and adapted, just as they had in every war before. In New York, a squadron of soldiers that had lost contact with Central Command began relaying messages through graffiti scrawled in alleyways, warning others of alien movements. In Moscow, subway tunnels became underground bunkers filled with volunteers who vowed to never leave the city, even if it meant death. In Rio de Janeiro, a local street gang transformed itself into a resistance cell armed with stolen weapons and led by a former military officer who had sworn never to fight again, but now carried a flamethrower into battle with a grin in his eyes. The Empire observed all this from orbit, confused but not concerned. They had seen resistance before in primitive worlds where the people would rise in anger for a few hours, then burn out like candles. But what they failed to realize was that Earth was a world born in war, shaped by conflict, and defined by survival for centuries. Humans had fought each other across every corner of the planet, and now that violence had a new purpose, a new enemy to unify against, and it was uniting fast, faster than the Empire could calculate or predict. As their dropships landed in cities, the invaders met more than gunfire. They met cunning, they met traps buried beneath roads and explosives hidden in dumpsters. They met rooftop ambushes and snipers who used the Empire's own targeting systems against them. They met people who had lost everything, and yet still ran toward the battle instead of away from it. They met children who threw rocks and hackers who rewired drones and elders who carried rifles passed down through generations and still knew how to use them. The Galactic Empire watched all this unfold and marked it down as statistical anomaly. They believed it would pass, as all resistance did, and soon they would send in more drones, more weapons, more terror. But what they could not see, what their senses could not measure, was that humanity was not fighting for victory, not even for survival. They were fighting because it was who they were. They were fighting because they refused to kneel, and every hour that passed, every alien soldier who fell, every Imperial machine reduced to scrap, brought Earth one step closer to the impossible. They struck with precision. Orbital blasts vaporized cities, and mechs stormed across continents. But in the shadows of destruction, the first spark of defiance was born in a shattered bunker beneath Tokyo, where a handful of survivors swore they would fight back, and that vow spread like wildfire. Not just through words, but through action, through sacrifice, through the blood that stained every street corner and scorched every skyline. The Empire assumed fear would silence resistance, but fear only fueled it, made it burn hotter than any plasma they could unleash. In the first 72 hours, over 100 major cities were hit with orbital strikes. Energy weapons carved through buildings like paper, and entire power grids went dark. But instead of chaos, there was movement, fast and silent, organized by instinct, not command. In the absence of governments and militaries, it was the people who rose, the doctors who turned hospitals into command posts, the teachers who drew battle plans in chalk on old classroom boards, the students who used smartphones to triangulate enemy landings before the last satellites fell. Empire commanders watched from orbit and declared progress. They saw maps filled with red marks and thought that meant victory, but red meant rage, red meant fire, red meant humans who had nothing left to lose and everything left to fight. For the alien ground troops discovered this too late. They moved in formation as they always had, walking side by side like machines wrapped in armor, pulsing with light. But the first explosions came from sewers beneath their feet, and the second wave came from rooftops, and the third from smoke-filled windows where nothing should have survived. One patrol unit vanished without a trace in what was once Los Angeles. Another disappeared in the ruins of Shanghai, their last transmission filled with static and screaming and strange symbols scratched into walls that had never been there before when scouts returned. To Bafta they told tales of eyes in the dark, of footsteps that moved without sound, of traps laid in places no soldier expected, traps made from their own tech, modified and reversed by human hands that should not have understood how it worked, and yet somehow did. In the heart of what was left of Berlin, a single man with no military background rerouted an Impia drone and used it to target its own fleet, watching in awe as blue fire erupted across the sky. He was later joined by engineers, hackers and refugees who turned a half-collapsed shopping mall into a drone factory, using salvaged scrap from alien wreckage and 30-year-old laptops. Meanwhile, in the mountains of Pakistan, an old warlord who once laid down arms took them up again, this time not against his neighbors, but against invaders from another world. He trained children and farmers alike in guerrilla tactics, ambush strategy, and how to use the terrain to their advantage. His unit became ghost stories whispered among the Empire infantry, who now refused to travel at night, and yet still the Empire believed this was all temporary, a flicker of resistance before the darkness swallowed it whole. They called it Phase 1. They thought they were winning, but what they were seeing was not a flicker, it was a fuse, and it had already been lit. The Empire laughed at the first human counterattacks, crude missiles, improvised traps, even soldiers charging with knives, but that laughter died quickly when their elite patrols started disappearing one by one without a trace in dense forests and broken cities. The aliens had been trained to fight organized armies in open combat with clear targets and defined fronts, but Earth gave them none of that. Instead, it gave them chaos, it gave them shadows, it gave them enemies who would strike and vanish, enemies who did not follow logic or pattern, enemies who were fighting with rage, not orders. In the jungles of South America, entire squads of alien mechs were swallowed whole by terrain they could not scan beneath. Thick vines and shifting, mud-hidden mines made from old war debris and repurposed alien power cores erupted under their feet and shredded their armor before they could even fire back. And in the icy forests of Canada, a resistance sniper who had once hunted elk, now hunted command units, never missing, never hesitating, and never staying in one place long enough to be caught. In the ruins of Paris, an old subway system became a maze of death, filled with tripwires, EMP pulses, and corridors mapped in the minds of children, who guided fighters through the dark like ghosts, unseen, unheard, unstoppable. And in the heart of what was once Cairo, an artist turned rebel painted enemy weak points on ruined walls, using stolen blueprints, giving every human fighter an edge in battle that the Empire could not explain. These were not just soldiers, they were survivors and scavengers and thinkers and madmen, all fighting for one cause, not victory but resistance. And resistance became contagious, became doctrine, became culture. In places where Empire drones expected to see panic, they saw graffiti instead, messages written in bold colors across broken buildings, saying, "We are still here," saying, "You cannot kill," an idea, saying, "Earth is not yours." At first the Empire responded, with more force, more ships, more soldiers, more fire from the sky. But every escalation led to more blood, and every drop of that blood hardened the humans who saw the faces of their dead and swore not to mourn but to avenge. And those vows turned into plans, and those plans turned into action, and soon the Empire began to feel something they had not felt in centuries, something they did not even recognize anymore: uncertainty. Their perfect formations began to break down under the weight of human unpredictability. Their soldiers hesitated before entering ruined cities. Their machines malfunctioned under strange hacks, and strange weather, and strange resistance they did not understand. And then came the first real loss: a command ship, ambushed by a stolen freighter rigged to explode in Earth orbit, the blast ripping through its hull and sending flaming debris into the atmosphere, where it burned like falling stars, as millions watched and cheered in silence from the ground. Empire called it sabotage, called it impossible, called it luck, but the truth was clearer than ever, and it spread through every outpost like static through a broken radio. These humans were not broken, they were awakening, and the more pressure the Empire applied, the more dangerous Earth became, not because of its weapons but because of the fire inside those who refused to be conquered. Every time the aliens adapted, humans adapted faster. They hijacked drones, rewired alien weapons, and used the ruins of their own cities as battlegrounds that turned into graveyards for imperial machines. What the Empire saw as primitive desperation was in fact the evolution of resistance, an intelligence that moved without hierarchy, a network without leaders, and a strategy born not from textbooks but from instinct, fury, and survival. In the flooded remains of Venice, a group of teenagers using scavenged gear managed to override the guidance system of an empire. Walker turning it into a walking bomb that crashed into a forward command base and crippled communications across southern Europe in the highlands of Ethiopia. A nomadic tribe used smoke signals to coordinate ambushes across 100 miles of terrain, never using a single electronic device, never giving the Empire a signal to trace, and never staying in one place long enough to be found. The aliens adjusted their tactics. They deployed hunter drones, stealth units, psychic scouts, meant to read human intentions, but nothing worked, because human intentions were not logical. They were emotional and unpredictable and wild, and no algorithm could process vengeance. No sensor could scan for hatred, and no predictive model could track the choices of people who had already accepted death and moved beyond fear in the underground bunkers beneath. Soul engineers worked beside poets and farmers beside hackers, turning captured alien tech into weapons not seen in any blueprint, fusing alien plasma coils with human railguns mounting pulse disruptors on motorcycles, turning anything and everything into an instrument of resistance in this war. Even a broken radio could become a weapon, even a child could become a scout, even a graveyard could become a trap. The Empire increased surveillance, launched new AI constructs to simulate human behavior in order to predict their next move, but the simulations failed again and again and again because humans did not follow patterns. They broke them and they bent them and they rewrote them with every breath and every act of defiance, and slowly the Empire began to realize that Earth was not like other worlds. Earth did not fall into step, it danced out of rhythm and sang in static and fought like a storm. Then came the miracle at Mumbai when a group of factory workers and schoolchildren used stolen energy cores to power an abandoned spaceport and launch a surprise missile at an orbiting dreadnought, striking it dead center and forcing it to crash into the Arabian Sea, turning the tide of battle across Asia and igniting uprisings in places that had been silent for weeks. The Empire watched the footage in silence, and, for the first time, some of them began to doubt the outcome of their campaign. In the Arctic wastes, an entire battalion vanished without a trace, and when search teams arrived they found only a message carved into the ice by hand: "We are the cold, now we are the storm." And in South Africa, a grandmother led a convoy of fighters into the heart of an Empire refinery, singing an old song that made even the alien sensors pause, just long enough to fall victim to the ambush. Waiting inside the war was changing, and for the first time, the Empire was not leading, it was reacting, and Earth had become the teacher, and the lesson was pain. Despite suffering heavy losses, humans never broke morale. Instead, they used captured alien tech to strike back harder and smarter. They learned quickly not just how to fight, but how to evolve, how to twist every defeat into a lesson, and every scrap of wreckage into a new weapon, or a new tactic. They turned ruins into laboratories, battlefields into classrooms, and war itself into an art form that the Empire could not understand in the depths of what was once new. Delhi engineers operated beneath the rubble by candlelight, combining alien gravity drives with railgun prototypes to create weapons that could tear through Imperial armor at close range. And in the hills of Peru, farmers repurposed mining equipment to tunnel into enemy camps, using the natural terrain to stay hidden until the moment they struck and vanished like smoke. The resistance became a network without borders or language barriers, united by pain and purpose and by signals too simple for the Empire to trace: hand signs, drum beats, coded graffiti, smoke trails, and shared songs that traveled faster than any satellite ever could. Songs of fire and thunder and earth, songs that carried through broken radios and echoed in enemy channels without translation. One by one, the humans began taking back key zones, not by overwhelming force, but by outsmarting, outlasting, and outmaneuvering their enemies. In the Pacific, a fishing fleet used underwater mines to trap an entire squadron of Empire submarines that had been monitoring oceanic activity, and in Alaska, a group of sledders led Empire scouts into a frozen valley where the ice cracked under the weight of their machines, plunging them into darkness with no way out. Empire officers grew frustrated, issuing contradictory orders, deploying more troops, and escalating firepower with every engagement. They believed numbers would end the conflict. They believed scale would crush spirit, but spirit is not measurable by any scanner, and it cannot be mapped by satellites. Spirit is found in the eyes of a wounded soldier who refuses to stop fighting, in the hands of a mother carrying a rifle for the first time in the ruins, of her village in the footsteps of a child, running messages through fire in Lagos. A resistance cell broke into an alien listening post and reprogrammed it to blast a looped message across all channels, a voice repeating the same phrase over and over: "We are Earth, we are the storm, we do not kneel." And across the globe, millions heard it and rose again stronger than before. The Empire tried to drown the signal with white noise, but white noise only made the message clearer, and they tried to silence the voice, but for every one, they silenced 10 more rose in its place. In Tokyo, in Nairobi, in Chicago, in remote forests and mountain caves and burning cities, the storm grew. Commanders, in orbit, began requesting retreats, asking for reinforcements that never came, because even the great machine that was the Empire could not supply an endless war, not when the enemy refused to die, not when the enemy grew stronger with every loss, not when every crater became a birthplace and every fallen soldier a spark for 10 more to rise. And so the Empire began to bleed and Earth began to roar. Empire communication lines were disrupted by human hackers, while drones and satellites were hijacked to feed misinformation to alien generals, and in every shadowed corner of the planet, a new kind of war unfolded, a war of signals, of silence, and noise, of lies wrapped in truth and truth buried in chaos. The humans had learned the language of the machines and twisted it into something the Empire could not decipher, something that moved faster than light and spread deeper than roots. In the cracked remains of old London, a blind coder worked through vibrations and heat to reroute a fleet of reconnaissance probes into an orbital loop that fed the Empire its own old footage, edited and distorted to delay their responses by hours, giving resistance fighters the edge they needed to strike and vanish before the Empire even knew where they had been. In a shattered data center beneath the frozen soil of Siberia, a collective of teenagers and ex-cybercriminals cracked the encryption on alien command algorithms and used them to scramble orders, sending reinforcements in circles, sending supplies to phantom outposts, sending dreadnoughts to empty skies, until even the most loyal alien captains began to question the commands coming from above. The Empire built its dominance on control, on clarity and chain of command. But Earth introduced noise and doubt and contradiction, and in that confusion, the humans found strength because they were born in disorder, raised in contradiction, and shaped by broken systems. They did not need perfect clarity to fight, they needed only belief and direction, and each other. In the ruins of Istanbul, resistance cells coordinated an attack by syncing old traffic lights across the city, each flash a signal to move or strike or vanish, while alien patrols watched in confusion, unable to see the pattern in the chaos, because there was no pattern, only intent and resolve and fire that refused to die. The skies, once filled with Empire eyes, became cluttered with debris and false signals, with hacked drones broadcasting war songs and scrambled data bursts and phantom fleets projected by hijacked satellites. And the Empire no longer knew what was real and what was a trap. They stopped trusting their sensors, their scouts, their maps, and without those tools they were blind, and humans knew how to fight in the dark. A captured outpost in what had once been northern China, an alien commander stared at the data streaming through cracked monitors, watching as his own forces moved according to human lies, marching into ambush after ambush, and he realized then that they were no longer at war with a species, they were at war with an idea, with a ghost that could not be touched or silenced or burned. On a stormy night over the Pacific, a human submarine surfaced long enough to broadcast one single phrase across the Empire's emergency frequencies: "The machines you gave birth to now serve us." And the sea swallowed the signal just as the Empire scrambled to respond, too slow, too late, too lost in their own grid of noise and ghosts and errors. And still the humans moved, still they struck, still they sang, and in the chaos they created, they became something new, something the Empire feared, something unstoppable. Then came the Battle of Johannesburg, where human fighters lured the Empire's flagship down with fake energy signals and detonated a hidden nuclear device that turned night into day and left the sky filled with falling metal and silence. The Empire had believed Earth incapable of such coordination, of such cunning, but what they failed to see was that humanity had stopped playing by the rules of war and had begun writing their on it. Started with a single broadcast, an old emergency beacon rigged with decaying batteries and layered sound loops, mimicking the distress call of an advanced rebel base. The Empire's long-range sensors detected the false pulse and dispatched a dreadnought to investigate, believing they had cornered a major resistance hub in the outskirts of the ruined city. What they found instead was a ghost town carefully rigged with radiation, shielding buried warheads, motion sensors, and the gutted husks of old skyscrapers filled with homemade explosives, triggered by the first step of the landing crews. And when the first transport touched down, the entire skyline ignited. A chain reaction that roared like thunder and split the air in every direction above the clouds. The dreadnought hesitated, but the signal continued, so it descended, drawn lower and lower by the growing pulse of bait, unaware that the humans had built a massive energy signature, using abandoned power plants and hacked Empire reactors buried under rubble, and timed to overload. The moment the flagship locked into position, the explosion cracked the sky. The fireball reached higher than the clouds, and the shockwave leveled everything within miles, but the humans had already vanished into deep tunnels, into old mines and subway systems. They had prepared for this, they had accepted the cost, and they had lit the fuse with steady hands and unshaken eyes when the smoke-cleared pieces of the dreadnought rained across the continent, chunks of its hull embedded in mountains, its engines boiling lakes, its weapons buried in ash and dust, and silence followed, not just in Johannesburg but in command centers orbiting above, where Empire generals stared at blank screens and scrambled data, unable to process what had just happened. Spread like wildfire through human channels, the invincible had been wounded, the untouchable had fallen, and in villages and cities and bunkers around the world, fists were raised to the sky in silent celebration, because it was proof that the enemy bled, and if it bled, it could be beaten. The Empire responded with fury, dropping fire on every shadow they suspected of harboring resistance, but every strike hit empty ground, every blast hit stone and echoes, because the resistance had already moved, already scattered, already planning the next fire, while the ashes of the last one still fell in. That moment a shift occurred, not in weapons or tactics, but in belief, and belief is more dangerous than any gun. It spreads without wires, without orders, without sound. Belief whispered from soldier to soldier and from survivor to survivor. Belief that they could win, that they were not prey but predators. And from that moment the war was no longer a defense, it became a hunt. Panic spread through the Empire's fleet as command structures broke down and soldiers refused to descend to the surface. Terrified of invisible enemies that never slept and never surrendered, some ships went silent, others disobeyed orders, while captains argued over conflicting data and ghost signals and false reports. Human resistance had become a virus, not of code but of chaos, infecting the Empire's certainty and unraveling their confidence. One lie, one explosion, one scream at a time, and the ground, what remained of the alien forces, were scattered and desperate, retreating from cities they had once claimed as trophies, pulling back from regions they had mapped and occupied and fortified, only to find that every corridor was now a trap, every rooftop a sniper's nest, every shadow filled with the whispers of the dead and the dying and the unbroken in what had once been the American Midwest. Human saboteurs led by former engineers rewired entire power grids to overload on Empire frequencies, frying their senses and communications and forcing their ships to navigate blind through the smoke and static of burned fields and shattered towns, where even the wind seemed to whisper threats. In Indonesia, a network of fishermen and former smugglers turned their boats into floating mines, patrolling the archipelago and sinking any Empire vessel that dared touch the water, using nothing but oil barrels, batteries, and hope. In the Sahara, human riders crossed dunes at night, relaying coded messages on solar-powered transmitters, evading all detection and coordinating attacks that arrived like lightning and vanished like sandstorms. The Empire tried to regroup, tried to rally its forces around strongholds that were now surrounded by civilians who were no longer afraid, who walked openly near their fortresses, carrying tools and scrap and sometimes nothing at all, staring with cold eyes that said, "We are watching, we are waiting, we are coming." A high-ranking Empire officer stationed in the ruins of Mexico City requested immediate extraction, claiming psychological warfare beyond measure, reporting that his troops were hallucinating, hearing voices in the night, seeing human silhouettes where none should be, watching machines malfunctioning under no clear cause. He said Earth itself was fighting back in orbit. A growing number of ships stopped responding. Some turned on each other amid accusations of betrayal or infection or false data. Others simply left, abandoning their posts and vanishing into the void, unwilling to fight a war they no longer understood against an enemy that had become legend. And still the humans moved, still they learned, still they adapted. They collected Empire tech and turned it into art, into warning, into weapon. They wore broken helmets like trophies, painted symbols of resistance onto captured armor, and broadcast messages in alien languages. Back to the stars, saying we are still here, saying you failed in refugee camps and ruined cities. New songs rose, sung by children who had never known peace, and warriors who had never known surrender, and old ones who had nothing left but memory and rage. Songs that told the story of the invaders who came with fire and found ice, the story of those who landed as gods and bled as men. The empire had come to conquer, but Earth had become something else. It had become a nightmare, a proving ground, a forge, and what came out of that forge would be remembered forever. Finally, the Empire pulled back, leaving behind scorched earth, broken machines, and a lesson carved in fire that no simulation could have predicted: that human spirit, fury, and unpredictability made them the most dangerous enemy they had ever faced. The order to retreat came not with ceremony or honor, but with silence and shame, whispered through fractured channels across a crumbling fleet that no longer believed in its own supremacy. The withdrawal was slow and bitter, not a strategic retreat, but an admission of failure. Ships rose through ruined skies under the eyes of those they could not defeat, watched by survivors covered in ash and blood, who did not cheer, who did not shout, who only stared back with the weight of a world that had stood unshaken against the storm on the ground. The final battles were not battles at all. They were acts of erosion, of resistance that would not end, that chipped away at the Empire's armor, one ambush at a time, one broadcast at a time, one whispered story at a time, until even the most loyal commanders began to question why they had come, and why they had stayed, and why they could no longer see victory on the horizon. And what remained of a shattered launch facility in the Andes, resistance leaders sent one final signal into space. Not a threat, not a declaration, just a single phrase in every known language: "We remember." And that phrase echoed through the static of 1,000 broken worlds, like a drumbeat in the dark, like a warning to any who would follow. The last ship left Earth's orbit under fire from stolen weapons launched from craters once filled with death, now filled with defiance, and though it escaped, it carried with it the ghosts of its own failure and the marks of a war it could not erase, not from its memory, not from its machines, not from the empire it once represented. On down below, Earth began to breathe again, not in peace, but in purpose. People stepped out from bunkers and rubble, blinking at sunlight that felt unfamiliar, holding each other without words, returning not to normal but to something new. Something earned, something forged in fire and blood, and unity. Cities would be rebuilt differently, with stories carved into walls and ruins kept as shrines, not to defeat but to resistance, and every child born would know what it meant to fight, not just with weapons but with will, with hope, with the belief that even when the sky falls, humanity is. No monuments were made, no flags were raised, no speeches given, because the war had not been won by a nation, or a hero, or a government. It had been won by people who refused to be erased, by people who stood up when everything told them to stay down, by people who had nothing left to give and gave more anyway. And somewhere deep in the cold, quiet corners of space, where empires whisper and stars remember, the story of Earth spread, not as a tale of conquest but as a warning, a legend, a truth that would echo forever. Ever underestimate a world that calls itself home.